Good evening, everyone. Tonight's story is based on true events whispered in South Korea, a tale that has gone viral among travelers and urban explorers. Hidden deep inside the misty peaks of Jirisan National Park, there is a forgotten mountain village known as Sori Mayo. Locals say this village is unlike any other because here, one simple mistake can cost you everything. If you ever hear your name being called after dark, you must never answer. Those who did were never seen the same way again. Why such a terrifying rule? What happens if you break it? Stay with me, because by the end of tonight, you'll understand the chilling truth behind this old Korean village, and why its silence hides more than just echoes. The first impression of Sori Mayo was not terror. It was familiarity. Min Ho, 28 years old, was not an adventurer or a priest. He was a filmmaker with a camera slung over his shoulder and a backpack heavy with spare batteries. His purpose was simple and relatable. He wanted to capture vanishing traditions before modernization erased them. He wasn't chasing legends or ghosts. He was chasing stories about farming, family, and the quiet dignity of lives lived away from neon lights. Anyone who has ever opened a camera app on their phone, anyone who has wanted to document something before it disappeared, could understand him. The trip to Sori Mayo fit neatly into his work. A professor had mentioned the village in passing, noting its unusual customs. To Min Ho, it sounded like a perfect subject for his small but growing YouTube channel. He told himself the journey was professional. A new video, a new upload, more views, more subscribers. At its heart, though, it was also personal. His grandfather had grown up in a rural valley much like this, and Min Ho had always regretted not recording his stories before he passed away. This trip felt like a second chance, a way to honor a generation fading too quickly. Normal, relatable environment. Arriving at Sori Mayo did not feel like stepping into a horror movie. It felt like stepping into a postcard. The road narrowed until it seemed to coil directly into the mountainside, and then the village appeared. Hanok houses with tiled roofs curving like wings. Smoke drifting upward from wood-burning stoves, the smell of firewood and earth in the air. Rice terraces climbed in deliberate steps toward the ridges, their water catching the light in 100 mirrors. Children played with sticks along the stone pathways, laughter carrying faintly but always subdued, as if taught to soften itself. It looked ordinary. It looked livable. It looked like a place someone might retire to after years in the city. Atmosphere, quiet streets, Hanok houses, rice terraces, and whispers in the air. Yet the longer Min Ho observed, the more he noticed a texture beneath the beauty. Conversations ended quickly when footsteps approached. Adults lowered their voices even in broad daylight. The laughter of children cut off sharply when the sun tilted west. In Seoul, streets were loud at all hours. Here, quiet felt like an additional resident, one who claimed the main road and the market square as its territory. He tried to film naturally, capturing women planting green onions, old men adjusting nets for drying peppers. Every frame looked picturesque, but when he played clips back, he realized how hushed they seemed. The images were rich, the sound was thin. Life here did not boom, it whispered. History. Over 600 years of isolation, Mr. Choi, the village chief, explained that Sori Mayo had stood in these mountains for more than 6 centuries, The name translated roughly to Voice Village, though outsiders assumed it referred to echoes in the valley. Roads were too narrow for buses, too twisting for trucks, which meant modernization had passed them by. Families lived in the same hanok their great-grandparents had built, each generation repairing stone walls, retiling roofs, tending to the same plots of rice. Isolation had preserved them. Min Ho admired that. Many of his documentaries mourned the loss of culture. Here, culture seemed almost frozen, intact as a museum exhibit, but alive with cooking smoke and foot traffic. He told himself he was lucky. He was not in a tourist brochure. He was in a secret. Rule: no one answers when their name is called after sunset. It was during tea in Mr. Choi's courtyard that the rule was mentioned. The chief poured steaming barley tea into bowls, and with the same casualness as telling a guest to remove shoes indoors, he said, "If you hear your name after dark, do not answer." He even smiled gently as he said it, as though the warning were a formality. Min Ho laughed politely, thinking it was a superstition, another charming local custom, like hanging garlic to ward off insects. But later, as the day ended and shadows slid longer across the rice terraces, Min Ho noticed how villagers acted. People hurried home before the sky went completely black. Doors closed firmly. Lanterns glowed inside windows, but the streets emptied quickly, unnaturally. And the silence that fell was not restful like countryside silence. It was tense, anticipatory. Makes the audience think, this could happen to me. For Min Ho, the scene was relatable. He had walked alone through quiet neighborhoods in Seoul. He had heard his name carried faintly by friends across a park. Nothing about those moments had ever felt dangerous. And now he was in a village where the rule was simple: do not respond, do not acknowledge. It sounded easy enough. Too easy. That was the hook. The ordinary man, with an ordinary purpose, in an environment that seemed picturesque and normal, had stepped into a place where silence was survival. The audience could imagine themselves in his shoes, camera in hand, heart steady, telling themselves they would remember the rule. And yet, deep inside, a question whispered louder than the quiet streets. What if I heard my name? Would I really ignore it? The first impression of Min Ho in the mountain village was everything he hoped for. Stone paths winding between hanok houses, smoke curling softly from chimneys, and the quiet rhythm of farming life seemingly untouched by the neon glow of Seoul. To his filmmaker's eye, it was perfect. But it didn't take long before the perfection began to feel slightly too arranged, as though the village itself was staging a performance. Min Ho was driven by a purpose. At 28, with a camera always slung across his chest, he carried himself like someone on the hunt for something vanishing. Rituals, practices, voices slipping into silence. His YouTube channel had grown modestly successful because he refused to dress up rural life with modern aesthetics. He filmed it plainly, letting weathered hands and empty roads tell their own stories. That sincerity had earned him trust with elderly subjects before, and it gave him confidence he would win the trust of Sori Mayo's villagers too. The road to Sori Mayo stripped away signal bars from his phone and layers of modernity from his surroundings. By the time he arrived, it felt as though he had slipped centuries backward. The houses were not just preserved, they were inhabited as though no one had ever left. Children played in dirt yards, Women dried vegetables on straw mats, and old men leaned on canes outside narrow gates. But the details were not entirely right. The children did play, yet their laughter ended abruptly when dusk began to creep across the valley. Conversations among neighbors never seemed to rise above murmurs, as if even casual greetings had to be rationed. Min-ho noticed, but he explained it away. Perhaps mountain air carried sound too easily, and the villagers were simply being polite. This was his first small, unsettling detail, and, as the formula demands, he chose to rationalize it. When Min-ho met the village chief, Mr. Choi, he expected the usual negotiation, explanations about his documentary, reassurances that he wanted to honor traditions, and practical talk about lodging. Mr. Choi, a man whose lined face seemed carved by decades of cold mountain wind, listened with a patience that bordered on amused indulgence. He welcomed Min-ho with the formality of a host, but also with a private caution that the younger man did not yet detect. Then came the first mention of the rule. "Don't answer if you hear your name," Mr. Choi said casually, almost as though reminding him to remove his shoes before entering a house. Especially after dark. Min-ho blinked, uncertain if he had misheard. He laughed politely and asked if it was a joke or some folk superstition. Mr. Choi only smiled. His eyes, however, were not smiling. For Min-ho, it was simply another colorful anecdote, something to sprinkle into narration when he edited his footage. For the audience, it was something else. A flare in the darkness, an unmistakable warning disguised as harmless advice. The first cracks in the facade. As he explored, more of these almost imperceptible signs presented themselves. An old woman at the well quickly stopped speaking when dusk fell, shuffling away without explanation. Children walking home carried bells tied to their belts, the sound tinkling faintly as though warding off something unseen. Each time, Min-ho lifted his camera, eager to capture these details, but dismissed the strangeness as mere local color. That night, as he lay in the guest house given to him by Mr. Choi, he played back his first day's footage. Everything looked normal on the screen. Farmers at work, children carrying baskets, smoke drifting. But one shot caught his attention. It was a wide frame of the main street where villagers passed in the distance. For a fraction of a second, every person in the shot had turned their head in the same direction, away from the lens, towards some invisible sound. Their expressions were blank but alert, as though listening. Min-ho told himself it must have been coincidence, the way people notice a bird cry or a dog bark. Yet something about the synchronicity unsettled him. He felt a prickling at the base of his neck, the kind that comes when a camera records more than the eye notices. Still, he rationalized again. He was tired, and paranoia was easy to manufacture when the only sound outside was wind moving through pine trees. He turned off the camera and lay down, promising himself that tomorrow he would capture the truth of this place without letting superstitions cloud his mind. Foreshadowing for the audience for Min-ho, the day ended with optimism, a village brimming with culture waiting to be documented. For the audience, however, the signs were already undeniable. The hushed voices, the synchronized listening, the casual warning from Mr. Choi. Each detail aligned into a pattern that Min-ho refused to see. And in that blindness, the rule of Sori Mayo had already begun its slow, inevitable test. The first time it happened, Minho was walking past the village shrine after dinner, the sky the deep ink blue that comes 10 minutes after sunset. Paper talismans trembled on the eaves like moth wings. From somewhere behind the ginkgo tree, a voice called in the familiar, almost playful cadence of soul slang, Minhoya. He stopped. The lane was empty, the shrine's incense a single thin ribbon. He waited for a second call, heard only wind combing through pine needles, and told himself it was acoustics. He went to sleep repeating the rational explanation until it felt true. By morning, the village had resumed its steady quiet. He filmed a rice terrace at golden hour. Elders moved through rows with the practiced grace of repetition, yet the oddness returned in small increments. From a courtyard well, he thought he heard his name again. Only the syllables seemed to rise not from the air, but the water, collapsing into ripples as he leaned over. A child accidentally kicked his tripod, mumbled an apology, then glanced toward the hills as if listening for a cue. When Minho asked an elderly woman about the shrine, she smiled and changed the subject to his parents, his health, whether he slept well at high altitude. That evening, as dusk settled like a lid, the voice came again, closer. Minhoya! He pivoted and called, "Who's there?" Footsteps never followed. The next morning, Mr. Choi's politeness thinned. "You heard your name being called?" Minho described the shrine, the well, the echo. Mr. Choi's eyes pinned a point just beyond Minho's shoulder, as if addressing a third presence. "Did you answer?" Minho hesitated. "I called back." The old man's voice hardened. "Do not. After dark, do not. Keep walking." He offered no theology, only procedure. When pressed for why, he waved it off. Mountain tricks, habits from older people. But the warning had a weight that felt heavier than superstition and lighter than a full explanation, as if a door had been cracked open but not wide enough to see the room. The strange events repeated, but they refused to repeat neatly. Audio from his street laps. He had set a small recorder on a windowsill, developed a low murmur just under the noise floor. When he lifted headphones and scrubbed the waveform, he could not make out words, only the cadence of a conversation that seemed to pause when he listened and resume when he removed the headphones. Twice that afternoon, dogs trotted past him without a bark, then bristled at empty alleys after he turned away. At the tailor's, a roll of thread unspooled across the floor with no visible tug. The shopkeeper snipped it clean and swept it up without comment. The villager's eyes often drifted a few inches to his left or right, then returned to him with the politeness of people refusing to stare at a burn. Intensity increased with the light's retreat. The third evening, his breath fogged before the temperature warranted it. He noticed that when the voice arrived, soft at first, then a shade too eager, lantern flames leaned toward the sound, as if a draft were passing through solid wood. Minhoya, shh. The syllables now carried a subtle mimicry, an echo of his own speech patterns from interviews he had filmed earlier that day. He walked on, heart pounding hard enough to jostle the viewfinder against his sternum. On the shrine's lintel, one talisman had loosened, its edge lifting and falling as though something on the other side were exhaling. He tried to recruit a witness. Over hot barley tea, he told a farmer about the calls, about the recordings that seemed to edit themselves when he listened. The man nodded, in the rhythm of someone hearing about a sprained ankle. "Mountain Air plays games," he said, then asked whether cameras from Seoul handled cold better than the old ones. Mrs. Han, when asked directly, said the valley had many birds that sounded like people if you were tired. A younger woman suggested Minho must be famous in the city if even the wind knew his name. In each exchange, the conversation slipped away from the point, as if the village had learned to sand the edges off the unexplainable. No one else noticed or believed, or perhaps noticing was precisely what they refused to do. That night, he staged a test. He placed a lav mic beneath the shrine's eaves, gaffer-taped a small LED to a post, and framed a static shot that held the lane, the ginkgo's shadow, and the line of talismans. He set a second camera 30 meters back to catch his approach. As he hit record, the village seemed to hold its breath. The LED hummed, cicadas stuttered, stopped, and then the now familiar call threaded the air. "Min ho ya." The sound did not travel from a single point. It arrived around him, as if the lane itself had spoken. He did not answer. The warning still sat fresh on his tongue. But he did step 3 paces toward the shrine to see whether the microphone would register what his body already knew. The temperature dipped. He felt it first as a tightening at the base of his skull, and a line of frost traced itself along the edge of a stone as neatly as a pen drawing a margin. From the well's direction came a splash without footsteps, and the paper slip that had been fluttering at the lintel peeled back a fraction farther. Back in the guest house, he reviewed the footage. The first camera held perfect composition, sound meters flicking with a whisper that had no corollary on screen. The second camera recorded him turning his head, tracking a voice that was not there. Between frames, his breath fogged and vanished. He replayed the clip with headphones, then without. The voice remained audible, its tone closer now, almost confidential. "Min ho ya." On the third pass, there was a second voice layered beneath the first, higher, uncertain, like a child rehearsing a name she'd been taught to say. The next morning, he told Mr. Choi he would pack up and leave soon. It was not the truth. The truth was that curiosity outweighed caution. He replaced batteries, wiped lenses, and coiled cables with the ceremony of someone preparing not merely to film, but to answer a question that had been forming since the first night. At twilight, when the village lamps woke and doors latched with that soft collective click, he slung the camera, pocketed the lav, and walked toward the shrine. When the voice came, closer than before, brighter, like a smile laid over a blade, he did not stop. He stepped beyond the last warm circle of lantern light and pressed record. The forest did not sound like a forest anymore. What should have been the rustle of pine needles and the crunch of Minho's boots became layered with voices. His name stretched thin and multiplied, sung as if the trees themselves had learned language. Minho ya, Minho ya. At first it seemed playful, like children teasing one another in a courtyard. Then the sound bent, twisting into a question that had never been spoken aloud. "Why are you filming us?" He froze, the camera quivering in his hands. The beam of his flashlight revealed only trunks and branches, yet the sound circled him, bouncing from directions where no person could stand. Leaves shivered though the air was perfectly still. Then movement slid into his peripheral vision, shapes that resembled people, but blurred at the edges as if cut from mist. They were clothed in hanbok, silks that glowed faintly despite the lack of light. Their steps made no sound. They drifted between the trees as if untethered from gravity. One figure slipped closer, a young farmer in rough linen, his face half hidden, yet eerily clear. Another followed, an elderly woman with a braided bun, her eyes glinting like polished stone. Then came the faintest outline of a child, her frame delicate, her hanbok tied in colours that looked centuries old. They did not walk. They glided, skirts trailing across soil without stirring a single blade of grass. Min-ho lifted the camera instinctively, desperate to capture proof, but the LCD betrayed him. Where his eyes saw movement, the screen showed only forest, dark trees, empty air. His breath quickened. He pivoted, recording each corner, but the result was the same. The footage erased the impossible. The voices pressed closer, now layered with inflections from different eras. The farmer spoke in the accent of decades long gone. The woman's tone carried the formality of an older generation. The child's voice was both fragile and impossibly mature. They were not merely calling his name. They were answering his thoughts before he could form words. You wonder who we are. We are those left behind. You came to hear stories. Let us tell them. You want to see what cannot be seen. Then look at us. Every syllable lanced into his mind like cold iron. Min-ho staggered backward, heart hammering. He tried to speak, but his throat locked. The more he resisted, the louder they became, a chorus synchronized with his own panic. The sound scraped along his nerves, growing shrill, then low, then thunderous, as if every possible pitch was pouring into his skull at once. Light caught their eyes. They reflected the beam of his flashlight like animal pupils, glowing with an intelligence that was neither human nor merciful. Their faces grew sharper, more real. Wrinkles deepened on the old woman's skin. The farmer's hands calloused before his gaze. The child's lips quivered with a cold breath he could feel against his cheek. None of them cast shadows. Their feet never touched the earth, yet frost bloomed in the soil where they drifted. Then came the violence of proximity. The child reached forward, placing her hand on his arm. He expected air. Instead, icy pressure gripped him, leaching warmth from bone to marrow. His muscles stiffened. His breath fogged instantly, though the night had been cool, not freezing. She tilted her head, voice flattening into something inhuman. Now you have answered. Now we can follow. The farmer's figure blurred, then sharpened again, as if adjusting to a reality it no longer belonged to. His hand closed around a branch, and the wood cracked, though his palm never truly held it. Splinters sprayed into the dark. The elderly woman leaned forward, her smile widening unnaturally, lips peeling back until her teeth glistened like shards. Min-ho raised the camera as a shield, not as a filmmaker. The red recording light blinked uselessly, documenting nothing but his terror. The spirits crowded in, their voices turning cruel, taunting. The villagers ignore us, but you answered. You are ours to keep. Take us beyond this place. The forest pulsed with their hunger. Trunks seemed to tilt inward, pathways folded into shadows. His flashlight flickered, then dimmed, leaving only the glow of their eyes. He tried to run, but his legs dragged as though wading through tar. Every direction he turned, figures glided closer, sealing the exits. The air smelled of rot and incense, cold and sharp, clogging his lungs. For the first time in his career, Min-ho felt utterly powerless. Not the anxious uncertainty of a documentarian lost in remote terrain, but the raw helplessness of prey. His curiosity, once a tool of his work, had betrayed him. By answering, by acknowledging, he had invited them to breach the boundary that had kept them confined for centuries. 1,000 voices surged at once, not spoken but thundered inside his mind. His camera trembled, his vision blurred, and he realized that survival itself might already be impossible. The mountain had opened its mouth, and he had walked willingly inside. The climax was not in sight of death. It was in the certainty that he had undone the silence that once protected everyone. Min-ho was no longer an observer. He was the door, and the door had swung wide open. The breach began the moment Min-ho crossed the threshold back into the village. The spirits did not stay behind in the forest. They clung to him, invisible to ordinary sight, yet heavy in the way the air thickened, in the way frost crawled across wooden doors, and in the way every dog in Sori Mayo howled as if at a storm no one else could see. The village had stood for centuries on the strength of one simple law: do not answer when called. Min-ho's mistake had rewritten that law into an invitation. Shadows with eyes too bright to belong to the living trailed him into the narrow lanes. An elderly woman in a hanbok drifted past a fence. A farmer's silhouette leaned close to a window pane. The lost child's small voice threaded between the houses, calling for mommy in a tone sharp enough to split stone. Doors slammed shut, lights extinguished. It was not panic, but protocol. The people of Sori Mayo had rehearsed this kind of night in whispered instructions passed from elder to child. They knew what to do. Stay silent. Stay hidden. Do not yield to memory, no matter how sweet the voice outside might sound. Inside each hanok, families pressed together, whispering protective prayers while children buried their faces in their parents' arms. The voices outside grew crueler with every unanswered call. They mimicked husbands, wives, childhood friends long gone. They spoke secrets they should not know. Family disputes, private griefs, memories locked in the villagers' own hearts. Every word was bait. Mrs. Sayo, widowed for decades, nearly faltered. At her door, the young farmer spirit described games he had played with her late husband. Memories only the dead could remember. Her hand hovered over the latch. Only the desperate shout of Mr. Choi from the shrine broke her trance. Yet that shout came at a cost. By acknowledging the spirits, even to stop them, Mr. Choi weakened the fragile barrier further. The talismans on the shrine walls burned at the edges, golden light flickering. At the shrine, Mr. Choi worked feverishly. Incense smoke thickened the air until it stung the eyes. His chants, drawn from generations of keepers, carried not as prayers, but as commands. Measured syllables, holding back an encroaching tide. He scattered bundles of herbs and metal shavings at the doorways, each burst sending the spirits writhing backward for a moment before they regrouped. Min-ho filmed it all, even as guilt clawed at him. He had not only endangered himself, but the entire community. His camera showed what his eyes could not deny. The spirits were growing more solid. They left frost on doors, hurled stones at walls, pressed cold hands against shutters. On the screen, their faces glowed pale and sharp, proof that the boundary between life and death was crumbling. The villagers did not flee physically. But each family endured a kind of flight within their own walls, retreating deeper into silence, resisting the urge to speak. It was an escape of will rather than of footsteps. For Min Ho, however, the only escape was inward. He fled into his lens, into the ritual unfolding beside him, into the faint hope that documentation might mean survival. By dawn, the immediate assault eased. The chanting, the charms, and the unyielding silence of the villagers had kept the spirits from fully crossing. But the scars remained. Frost patterns lingered on doors like fingerprints. Children wept in their sleep, muttering the names that had called to them. Mrs. Seo could not stop shaking, her hand still aching from the near touch of the door latch. Min Ho carried deeper wounds. He had seen the spirits clearly, felt the child's hand drain his warmth, heard voices inside his own thoughts. Even as the sun rose, he could not forget their stories. Deaths in snow, in war, in earth that swallowed whole. They were etched into him, and no ritual could erase that. The village had survived the night, but only barely. The protective barrier was weakened, the rules stretched thin. Every whisper proved that survival depended not on strength, but on silence, not on fighting, but on enduring. And though the dawn brought light, everyone knew the darkness would return. For Min Ho, there would be no true escape. He remained the bridge between two worlds, carrying the weight of voices that should never have been answered. The truth of Sori Mayo had been whispered for centuries, but only when the barrier began to fail did Mr. Choi speak it aloud. The mountain itself was not a refuge, not even a cage. It was a courtroom, an ancient place of judgment where restless souls lingered until their stories could be weighed. Long before Min Ho ever carried a camera into the valley, deaths had gathered here like mist. Soldiers from the Japanese occupation, buried in shallow graves. Farmers taken by landslides, their bodies unrecovered. A widow executed for sheltering rebels. Children lost in winter storms. All had one thing in common. They died within sight of the mountain. Their tragedies were unfinished, unresolved, and their voices did not fade. The villagers' ancestors recognized the danger of living so close to these unquiet dead. The first families created a binding. They mixed ash, iron, and salt, wrote charms on paper, and placed them across doors and beams. They passed down one commandment: do not answer when your name is called after sunset. It was not simply superstition, it was a covenant to keep the dead contained. To respond was to invite. To invite was to weaken the judgment that held the spirits in place. For generations, the system worked. The ghosts called, but the living ignored them. The mountain's balance remained intact. Now, as the spirits pressed against the doors of Sori Mayo, Mr. Choi revealed the records hidden in the shrine. A cracked wooden board held grooves burned for each breach, marking winters when voices had been strongest. A faded scroll carried the formulas for the barrier written in old script: pine ash 3 parts, iron filings 1, salt 1. Margins carried notes from ancestors: do not speak the child's name. Silence after dark sustains the wall. These were not myths, but instructions, tested and preserved. Mr. Choi also showed Min Ho the heart of their protection, the shrine itself. Its walls were layered with hundreds of talismans, each renewed every season. They did not honor gods, they reinforced a boundary. As incense smoke filled the air, Mr. Choi's chant resonated like gears turning inside an invisible lock. But he admitted the truth. The lock was breaking. By answering the spirits in the forest, Minho had given them shape. By filming them, he had granted them image. By acknowledging them, he had become their bridge. "This mountain judges," Mr. Choi explained, sweat beading on his brow. "Our contract suspended that judgment. You ended the suspension." Suddenly, every strange detail of the past days aligned into a single truth. The villagers' hushed voices, their refusal to walk alone after sunset, the way children were trained to ignore the sound of their own names. These were not eccentricities, but survival tactics. The silence of the nights, the abrupt end to conversations, the fear in the elders' eyes whenever Minho pressed for details. All were signs of a community bound by a fragile covenant. Even Minho's own footage fit the pattern. In the forest, his camera had shown only empty trees, because the contract still held. But inside the village, once the barrier was weakened, the spirits appeared clearly in his recordings. The difference was not his lens, but the law of acknowledgement. Once recognized, the dead gained form. The villagers had not merely lived alongside ghosts, they had maintained a centuries-long quarantine, a spiritual firewall separating the living from the dead. By turning around, by speaking, by following, Minho had torn a hole through which the voices poured. Now there were only two paths. Mr. Choi could attempt to reinforce the barrier, but the spirits were adapting quickly, learning to mimic memories and manipulate emotions. Every attempt to speak, every hesitation from a villager risked collapse. The alternative was harsher. Remove the protections completely and allow the mountain's ancient purpose to resume. The judgment would not be merciful. It would annihilate the spirits, ending their hunger, but also ending their existence. The scroll held one final clause. The release required a witness who had crossed the boundary, someone who had spoken and been spoken to. All eyes turned to Minho. He had answered. He had acknowledged. He was already entangled. Realization spread across his face. He had come to record forgotten traditions. Now he had become part of one. He set his camera inside the shrine so that it would capture the final act. Then he stepped into the street, frost blooming at his feet, and spoke to the mountain itself. "I acknowledge." The voices shrieked, the talismans flared, and the contract shattered like paper burned to ash. The judgment began. By dawn, the spirits were gone, dissolved into silence. The village remained, but Minho had vanished, leaving only his camera and the footage that proved what he had seen. At last, all the earlier signs, the hush, the silence, the rule, made sense. They were not folklore. They were the thin line that had held back a courtroom of ghosts. What do you think? Would you dare answer if your name was called in the dark, knowing that it might not be a living voice at all? In Korean folklore, names hold deep power. To speak or answer a name is not just recognition, it is an invitation, a thread tying the living and the spirit world together. Villagers like Sori Mayo remind us that rules born from fear are often rooted in survival. The act of silence was not superstition, but a cultural safeguard passed down for centuries. By refusing to acknowledge, the villagers were not only protecting themselves, but also respecting the unseen boundaries between life and death. Stories like this echo across Asia, warnings whispered by elders, customs that may look strange to outsiders, but which carry layers of history and spiritual memory. Whether you see it as myth, tradition, or truth, the lesson remains. Not every call deserves an answer. If this story gave you chills, let me know your thoughts in the comments. Would you follow the rule, or would curiosity tempt you? Don't forget to subscribe for more haunted legends and forgotten rituals. In our next episode, we'll travel to another hidden place where old beliefs guard secrets modern life cannot explain.